Can the U.S. military learn from its repeated mistakes? It is a question that is about to be answered. It was almost a year ago that a U.S. Reaper drone carried out the now infamous drone strike in Kabul, a strike that was framed at the time as self-defense, or certainly as a self-defense attack against an imminent ISIS threat. Now, this was just 3 days after an attack by a suicide bomber at Kabul's airport on August 26 that killed at least 170 Afghans and 13 U.S. service members. The U.S. claimed its strike hit a car with an ISIS bomb. But nearly everything that senior Pentagon officials claimed afterward turned out to be wrong. It was an on-the-ground forensic investigation by the New York Times that helped uncover what really happened.
The United States fired a missile from a drone at a car in Kabul. It was parked in the courtyard of a home, and the explosion killed 10 people, including 43-year-old Zamarai Ahmadi and 7 children, according to his family.
Now, the U.S. killed 10 innocent Afghans, not ISIS fighters, civilians. Children. At first, it was called a, quote, righteous strike. And then months later, after months of internal investigations, the Pentagon decided no one would be held accountable, but it did acknowledge they made a, quote, honest mistake.
The investigation found no violation of law, including the law of war. Did find execution errors confirmed by combined with confirmation bias and communication breakdowns that regrettably led to civilian casualties. It's an honest mistake. I understand the consequences, but it's not criminal conduct.
No one was held accountable for that mistake. People were rightly appalled about what happened in Kabul. It was a horrific attack on innocent people. But the thing is, this was not an exception. Civilian casualties in the course of U.S. combat operations have been a defining feature of our foreign wars in the last 2 decades. This shouldn't have been a surprise. A massive New York Times investigation last December uncovered widespread and systemic failures by the U.S. to prevent thousands of civilian deaths in places like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, many of them children. A trove of internal Pentagon documents and visits to more than 100 locations revealed cases where civilian casualties were erroneously dismissed. When civilian deaths were acknowledged, they were often significantly undercounted. And that, in many cases, the civilian toll was nearly doubled what was acknowledged by the military. Imagine that, civilian death tolls that are nearly double what the U.S. military acknowledges. You know, at some point, you have to wonder what's an honest mistake and what's just outright negligence, a disregard for human life. For what it's worth, a year after the strike in Kabul, the Pentagon now is trying to address this moral failure. The agency released a 36-page civilian harm mitigation and response action plan this week. It lays out sweeping changes to reducing risks to civilians in military operations, including, quote, integrating civilian protection into its mission objectives from the start. So more than 20 years after America's war on terror was launched, decades after expanding our drone program, and thousands of civilian casualties later, it's about time. So how will this action plan be implemented, and could it lead to substantial changes? And what, if anything, is this new directive missing? Joining me now is Azma Khan. She's the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist behind the investigation into civilian casualties caused by U.S. drones and precision bombs. She's also a professor at the Columbia Journalism School. Azma, it's great to have you with us. So tell us about what you've learned around this new Pentagon action plan. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin had said back in November that the agency was finally going to overhaul military procedures to address civilian casualties. But based on your reading of this plan, does it offer substantial changes that would and could help mitigate civilian casualties?
So this plan, thank you for having me. This plan has been in the works for quite a while, and many civilian casualty protection advocates, many human rights experts, many military experts themselves have been calling for these kinds of changes for a while. And I think many of them were surprised to see some of their recommendations implemented or at least written about in this plan, right? The idea that they should take greater precautions in assessing an environment before they bomb it for civilian presence, for civilian infrastructure. The idea that the United States needs to be thinking more about means of amends and how to respond to victims, whether that's through payments or medical care or the repair of damaged structures and facilities, as well as the idea that, there are many survivors, victims who didn't have a means to report allegations. And part of this plan also includes a means for people to submit the fact that they were bombed and put forth evidence on the internet. Now, you can ask, why is this only happening now? Shouldn't this have been done decades ago? And it's really been a slow process with the Department of Defense and multiple times claiming that strikes were righteous. I think in some ways the Kabul strike was different for the public to watch, these kinds of statements fall apart so quickly, but it was also just the culmination, I think, of a great body of reporting that showed that this wasn't just twice as high, right? That was just in cases where these were already admitted. The last time that I did a ground sample, the sample I found on the ground was 31 times higher than what the US military claimed. And it's really, I think, a look at how we lost Afghanistan and why that is prompting some of this.
Let me ask you about that for a moment. Your Pulitzer Prize-winning Times investigation last year, as you just mentioned there, found a lot of disparities between the U.S.'s estimate of civilian deaths in any incident and the reality on the ground. Will anything in this new 36-page plan help fix that particular issue in terms of the reporting and how many civilians have actually been killed? Do we even have an estimate of that?
So the Pentagon does publicize some statistics about how many people are dying in the war, in airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, in the war against ISIS, but as I mentioned, those numbers have been wrong. This plan outlines, the creation of a center staffed with 30-some people, ostensibly to really have better data. They really call it cutting-edge data, but they don't specify several key things. They don't say whether the military investigators will actually be on the ground looking into these incidents, and I think that's a key difference between why my numbers were so different from theirs. They don't say whether people will actually be held accountable. In the more than 5,400 pages of records I obtained in years-long lawsuits against the military of its own reviews, there was not a single instance in which a single military official or officer or regular person in the military was found guilty of any wrongdoing or faced any disciplinary action for any of the civilian casualties or allegations of casualties. So those are missing in this report, and many civilian casualty experts are saying it's not just the fact that you need those kinds of details, but many say that for far too long the military had been left to oversee itself, and this plan also sort of rests that responsibility with them. There really is an external mechanism for oversight.
Are there, as someone who has been covering this subject for years, are there things that Congress could be doing to help address the issues of civilian casualties and accountability? Is there an oversight role for Congress to play here with these types of programs? Because are the laws on our books protecting the military, or do they give the military this ability to carry out these operations without any accountability, like you were just saying from your research?
It's a great question. Several years ago, after the publication of an investigation I did called The Uncounted, Congress passed legislation that was supposed to create a new civilian official in charge of civilian casualties who was supposed to release a civilian casualty policy. That was passed in 2018, and yet that policy did not materialize, that plan, until yesterday. Right? And that was passed back in 2018. I've spoken to congressional oversight officials who, after these documents were made public, told me, wow, we've never actually seen anything like this. We're going through these, we're reading them, we don't have access to this. And I just thought, wow, I obtained these redacted through the Freedom of Information Act. Like, yes, I had to sue to get them. But congressional oversight officials haven't even been able to see them unredacted. What does that tell you about whether or not that the teeth really exists in that kind of oversight when it comes to the U.S. military. You know, I have really strong questions about that. And I've heard former administration officials tell me stories about times in which they had tried to exert some changes or have some kind of external oversight and were really rebuffed, you know. So it really depends on, you know, what we see in terms of what information they'll make public, you know, whether others will be able to cross-check a lot of this work, you know, some of these claims they're making. There's a long timeline at play. A lot of this won't materialize until 2024. And by that time, a lot of the pressure we've seen build up on them may have gone down considerably.